On this week's episode of the Autohaus podcast.
And she's like, oh, okay, yeah, that seems like a good idea. Man, I don't know how she thought it was a good idea, but...
Hopefully she doesn't listen to this episode of the podcast either.
Yeah.
This is the Autohaus podcast. I have another guest from all the way on the other side of the country, the doctor himself. Can you say your name and give yourself a short introduction?
Yeah, my name's Devin Crezee. I run a YouTube channel and social media pages and a website called Doctored Garage.
So first of all, congratulations. MB Drift Series first place in 2020. Congrats, man.
Thank you.
I think you've always been on my radar. Like, you've consistently put out great content. And I mean, thanks for being one of those Corolla guys that, you know, regularly puts out content. And I've watched you through this drift series and amazing. Like, talk a little bit about this MB Drift Series.
Yeah, man. So I moved to South Carolina about 3 years ago. I actually lived in Michigan before that. And as we were moving to South Carolina, I moved here for a job and I was trying to find a place that had drifting. And my job is a regional job, so I cover most of South Carolina and part of North Carolina. We were trying to find a place to live in. And we found the MB Drift Series, the Myrtle Beach Drift Series, and was like, oh, perfect, let's go move there. So we could, you know, be involved in drifting here and have a track in our backyard. Because up in Michigan, the track was about an hour and a half away, and that was kind of hard for my wife to come out to drift events, and I was street driving my car at the time. So that was always a little sketchy, street driving a beam swap Corolla an hour and a half to get to the racetrack with no guarantees if I was going to be able to drive it home. So... You know, I moved out here, 3 years ago and got really excited about being able to drift out here. And it was my first time I've ever doing any kind of competition. And up until I'm moving here, I had never done any tandems. So it was really cool to come out here, and start, figuring out the drift community. And then it was like the second event was a competition event. And I just went out there to get seat time and I qualified. And they're like, all right, cool. So you're going to go out in tandem now. I'm like, I'm going to go do what now? And, it's been really great. I met some really great people through the drifting here and through the competition series. And it builds a lot of skills that I had never done before. I hadn't really focused on because I was just focused on going out and drifting and having a good time. And it's really cool. So the drift series here, last year they added a 225 width tire cap because it's meant to build drivers up kind of from the beginnings of competition. So like I said, I had never tandem before coming out here. And so it starts people at that skill level and builds people to graduate to go to Pro-Am and Pro 2. And there's actually a few drivers that got started in the Myrtle Beach Drift Series that now compete in Pro 2 and in Pro 1. So, that's how it's catered towards, and which is great because, having a tire cap, at least a width cap, it really levels the playing field. That and having tighter, more technical courses. So people who have, 500-600 horsepower don't have an advantage over, a little 200 horsepower Corolla. That's
a really good point because I remember in one of your more recent videos, you were up against that like twin turbo 350Z. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was thinking to myself, like, there's no way.
Yeah, I got really lucky, driving with him. I battled him in the last two, in round 2 and in round 3, because this year we only had 3 rounds of competition because of COVID and the Myrtle Beach Speedway closed down. So they sold it to developers, and so we had a really shortened season because of COVID and that. But, I battled, his name's Hugo, and he's the 350Z master. He's got like 4 or 5 of them, I swear. And, I battled him in round 2 and battled him in round 3, and I thought for sure I lost to him because I straightened out. And it was in a rear zone, and I thought that I was like, oh man, he got it because I straightened out. I had to scrub a bunch of speed real quick, and I just couldn't keep the car drifting. Whereas, him and having, about 500 horsepower, he can scrub a bunch of speed and then just throttle to power out of it. But what the judges said was, it was because he slowed down, he decelled in a non-decel zone, and he hit one of the clips in that rear zone with like his door. So, they said, well, you scrubbed a bunch of speed so you wouldn't hit him, and that's why he straightened, because he was offline. So they gave me the win because they said, oh yeah, he was offline. I had no idea afterwards. I went over to the judges, was like, There's no reason for me to win that. And they explained it to me and they showed the video and I was like, oh, okay, cool. Like that's good to see. Like, that's pretty neat.
You mentioned a little bit of something that kind of gave me a gut punch. So you said that track that you guys were competing at, that's going to close down and be developed into something else?
Yeah, it's a real bummer. The track, the reason why I moved here was for drifting at the Myrtle Beach Speedway, and it closed. We had the last automotive event there was our drift event, and just a few weeks later, they already had all the demolition equipment out, and they were tearing down the grandstands and everything. So it's pretty heartbreaking. This track has been here for 50 years. It's got a bunch of NASCAR heritage. Even like Dale Earnhardt Jr. grew up driving at the Myrtle Beach Speedway. So tearing it down was, for us, we've been drifting, the Myrtle Beach Drift Series has been there for 15 years. And all the circle track and the NASCAR guys, they know about the history of this place, and it was rough on them too. And it's really sad to see, a track close. But, the ownership, last ownership before selling to developers, they didn't really take care of the place. They didn't really promote it very well. In my opinion, things didn't look like they were promoted very well. The drifters, we were paying out of our own pocket, or the Myrtle Beach Drift Series just paying out of their own pocket to add paving and to fix potholes and things like that the facility wasn't taking care of.
This is a really sad common theme that tracks are closing down across America, and even big tracks that you wouldn't even think of. With Laguna Seca in my backyard, it's constantly on my mind where, every year or, even every month, the fate of Laguna Seca is kind of always in limbo.
Yeah. Yeah. It is a common theme and it is really sad. I remember one of my buddies from college, his mom lives right down the street from Irwindale. And he was telling me, when we were in college together, he's like, yeah, every single year they say they're going to close it down. They say they're going to close it down, but they still haven't done it yet. And so we thought, oh, maybe that's what's going to happen in the Myrtle Beach Speedway. They're just saying it's going to close down so you can build a bunch of media hype and get a bunch of people back out to the races. And oh no, it closed.
So where does that leave the future for, everyone, right? The MB Drift Series, you, everyone else that's part of the drift community or even track community out there. Where does that leave you guys in the future?
That's that's something that I've become involved with the Myrtle Beach Drift Series this year and helping them plan out events and organize stuff. And then, at the end of the series, because I won, the rule book says, I can't compete again in the same car. And I'm okay with that because I've become kind of like staff now. And so I've been helping network with a couple of different tracks and try and get us a new place to drive at. And we've gone out and tested a few tracks. We're still looking for our home. The hardest thing for us is, the number of tracks in the Carolinas are pretty limited as far as drifting because a lot of them are just circle tracks. There aren't very many tracks that have a big paddock or a big skid pad or have any kind of road course, but we found a few. So we've got really high hopes for next season. We're waiting to hear back from a few places to finalize our plans, but if all goes well, we're going to have a really, really cool venue, if not one, but two venues for next year that I'm really excited about, but I can't give away too many more details other than that.
Yeah, well, I'm rooting for you, man, because honestly, the more people I talk to, even like out of the country, the future of motorsports looks more bleak and bleak by the day. And, talking to people, I would hope that we can all come together and figure out what we need to do to, keep our, more than a hobby, like a lifestyle, keep this alive for all of us and future generations.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope so too. That's one of the things when we've been looking at tracks, we've even been looking at places that we can invest in to add paving if we need to. And the big thing we realize is we've got to look at tracks that are far outside of normal, large populated areas because, what we learned with the Myrtle Beach Speedway is that it was right here, such a great location for people to go on vacation with their family and come drifting for the weekend. Come down, stay at the beach and go drifting, turn a drift event into a whole family vacation. But the property was worth way more than the track was. So, the previous owner, he bought it for $3 million and sold it for $10 million. He made $7 million off of just letting it sit there and rot and decay and not do anything at the track for, 5 years until somebody offered him a bunch of money for it because the land was worth so much. So we've been, the tracks we've been looking at are either privately owned by, an individual or a family or, further out in the countryside a little bit where we know it's not going to be sold to developers. We don't have to worry about that.
Switching to a happier topic, let's talk about Corollas a little bit. So, how did you get your start into this chassis?
So that's actually a really great question, and it's a funny story. I was never into drifting. I thought Tokyo Drift was really cool, and I thought that was pretty neat. But I was actually a Subaru kid, so I had a Subaru WRX, and I've actually owned, I think, 6 or 7 Subarus. But my buddy from college, we both were in the Toyota automotive program together, and he was super into drifting. This is the one that lived down the street from Irwindale, and so he was, he saw that I liked Tokyo Drift, and I thought drifting was pretty neat. So he was talking to me, oh, we got to get drift cars, and he taught me what an AE86 was. I had no idea what it was. And then as I was driving from, I'm from Phoenix, Arizona, and I was going to college up in Ogden, Utah, and I was taking this little mountain pass that's a shortcut, saves me a couple hours, and I'm driving through this tiny little town way out in the mountains in Utah, and I sit there and I see this little red car next to this house in the woods, and I'm like, is that an A86? Like, no, there's no way that's an 86. There's no way. And so then, that was as I was heading back up to college. And then the next time as I was heading back down to Phoenix to, go back home for the summer, I was looking for it. And sure enough, it was an 86. And I stopped and I knocked on the door and nobody was home. So I left them a note saying, hey, I want to buy your old red Corolla. And a few weeks later, I was, fixing some Subaru problems, blowing head gaskets. And I get a call from some random Utah number I didn't recognize. And I just happened to pick it up. And, I didn't think anything of it. And the guy said, yeah, my name's Bert. I got your note that you want to buy my Corolla. And I sat there, was like, what's he talking about? Oh, the 86. Yeah, man, yeah. So I bought it for $300, non-running SR5, towed it home, got it running with a few friends, and then I drove it from Phoenix to Utah, and then the 4AC blew up promptly, 2 weeks after I got there. And that was 9 years ago.
Oh, wow. And fast forward today, you actually took a cross-country drive and picked up another Corolla in Arizona. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I somehow talked my wife into buying a hatchback 86 shell from a friend of mine. It was, interior totally stripped out, missing 2 windows, the taillights were busted, but it came with a Celica Super axle sitting inside of the car. It's not bolted on yet. And I got a really good deal on it, and I talked my wife into buying it, saying, hey, we should buy this for our son so I can fix it up for him to drive when he's old enough to drive, and he's only a year old. And she's like, oh, okay, yeah, that seems like a good idea. Man, I don't know how she thought it was a good idea, but...
Hopefully she doesn't listen to this episode of the podcast either.
Yeah. But hey, I'm happy, and then, we flew out there. We went to go spend time with my family in Phoenix, and we picked up a truck, which is my old truck I drove in high school. It's just been sitting in storage. My folks haven't been using it, so I picked it up, and we grabbed the car dolly and grabbed this hatchback and towed it back across the country. And I tell you what, man, that was an adventure, because I didn't even crawl underneath the car, which I definitely should have, because 3 hours into the trip, we just passed through Tucson, and the front bolt for one of the lower forelinks fell out. We had pulled off the road to take care of my son real quick, and as I pulled back on, the bolt had fell out, and the forelink got caught on the edge of the road, and the car jumped 2 feet in the air as the forelink rotated under the axle.
Oh my God.
So, we get pulled back off the side of the road, and I had to use a come along and a ratchet strap to get the axle back into place. It bent all the forelinks in the panhard bar. It took me 2 hours to get that forelink bolted back up, so that way it was somewhat aligned, and I grabbed another bolt from the auto parts store, and it was an adventure for sure.
Good times. So that red SR5, is that the current one you have now? Is that the same car?
Yeah, so the car I bought 9 years ago is my drift car now. So, stock started its life as a stock SR5 when I got it. And now it's got the beam swap and, a cage I built, put in it, and that's the car I compete in. And then I also picked up another red SR5 coupe as a parts car it's kind of rusty, and one of the previous owners got rear-ended when he was bringing it home on a trailer, and so, the rockers are all smashed and stuff from it doing that, and I picked that up so I can swap all of the parts from that into the hatchback.
Was there an in-between from the 4AC to the beams, or did you do a beam swap right after that 4AC blew up?
So I first did a 4AG swap, like most people, and I blew up the 4AG 2 or 3 times, and I really didn't get a whole lot of enjoyment out of it when it was 4AG powered, because it was when I was first learning about engine swaps and first learning about a lot of automotive stuff. And so I kept blowing it up, and I would go cheap on a bottom end rebuild. And I wouldn't, like, I forgot to, like, the last rebuild, I didn't replace the oil pump. And so I went out for a drift event, and after like 2 days of drifting, the bearings were already gone again. And I sat there for a while debating, okay, do I build a turbo 4AG or do I do a beam swap? And the car sat non-running for about a year while I figured it out. And in that year, beams went from being like almost $4,000 for an engine and transmission down to, $1,500. And then it was a no-brainer. It's like, okay, it's time to put a beams in this thing. But there wasn't any real information at the time as to how to do a beam swap.
So how'd you do it? And what year did you do this beam swap?
So let's see. I started the beam swap. I've had it running and driving for 4 years, and I had it down for a year when I moved from Utah to Michigan. So I probably started the swap about 5 years ago and finished it 4 years ago. And I think it's about right. It might have been 6 and 5, but I was looking for the information and I really couldn't find anything. So I started a Facebook group, just to try and attract some attention and see if I could find some people, which is the Beams 3SG A86s group. And I was absolutely astounded. So many people joined almost immediately, people from all over the world that have been running beams in their cars for a long time. And so I started compiling the information from this group. And that's how I started my website and my YouTube channels, from all the information I got from this group. And I couldn't have done it without these guys. And it's interesting to see, I started as somebody who's just looking for information. And now I feel like I've got all this information memorized in my head because I see it so much, and I answer the questions all the time now since I have the experience from it, on one car. And it was, it's pretty cool. I've interacted a little bit with John Rusikoff because he interacts in that group to, sell his products and to figure out new ones. Excessive Manufacturing a little bit. Simon from Surfab down in New Zealand. I think they're in New Zealand. Just, it's really cool to see a bunch of these big companies, in this Facebook group that I started because I wanted to know information and see them asking me questions. It's pretty neat. It's something I never expected would happen because I was just trying to figure out how to put a beams in my car.
So since you've done the beam swap, and then now that beams is essentially a drop-in swap where everything's available for it off the shelf, have you updated any of your old stuff since you first completed the swap?
Not really. When I built my car, I was very much on a budget, on a shoestring budget at the time. So instead of buying mounts from, say, Excessive Manufacturing, because they were the only company I think at the time that made drop-in mounts, I had a buddy with a plasma table, and so I cut up some pieces of cardboard and took them to him, and I said, "Oh, can you cut these out for me on out of some plate?" And so that's how I made my motor mounts and my transmission mount. And it's worked so well for me that I haven't felt the need to go and update anything. But as more parts have been available, I've changed a few things. Like for a while, I didn't have a working speedometer because I didn't know how to hook up the A86 mechanical speedometer to the J160, and then SQ Engineering came out with the adapter, which is, I think it's actually from a W series transmission. It's just a Toyota part that fits in the J160, and you can thread the A86 speedo cable onto it. So, there have been a few things, but for the most part, I've left it how it is because, I haven't had the need to change anything. It works great for me.
Do you run subframe spacers on that car?
I do. That was one of the hardest things, or one of the most frustrating things that I think about doing subframe, or about doing the beam swap is, at first I use 1-inch subframe spacers, and they really are necessary if you don't want to modify your firewall at all. That's one of the things with the J160 is the bell housing is so large. So I had 1-inch subframe spacers. I hammered out the firewall a little bit because the mounts I built puts the engine just a little bit further back than what you can buy on the market today. And then I actually switched from 1-inch subframe spacers to 1/4-inch subframe spacers, and I had to reroute my fuel lines and my brake lines, but it doesn't, it gives me a little bit better ground clearance. That was the biggest thing, is the beams is so tall and the oil pan hangs so low. So I try and get away with running the small subframe spacers I can, not necessarily because of suspension geometry, but just because I don't want to rip off an oil pan, because I've already smashed my oil pan a couple of times. And that's when I switched from the 1-inch to 1/4-inch and got a little bit more ground clearance. I haven't had any issues since then, but...
Yeah, I'm actually not too familiar with the beams market, but is there a long-term oil pan solution for beam swapped guys right now?
There's actually, I think it came out this year, earlier this year, Surfab came out with a beam swap oil pan. And it's an oil pan and a pickup tube that's shortened, I think, about half an inch, because usually the beam's oil pan hangs about 1 inch to half an inch below the subframe. And so Surfab came out with this oil pan, and it's widened, so it's got wings too, and it fills in perfectly, those spaces between the subframe and the tension rod brackets. So it fills that out real nice, so you don't lose any oil capacity. MRP, Mannon Racing, products or performance, they were working on a solution, and they never finalized it. And then, Surfab came out with this product that it's phenomenal. I haven't been able to get my hands on one yet because, well, it doesn't fit with the Blitz supercharger I put on my car, but I'm planning on putting one on my hatchback because that's going to stay naturally aspirated.
So I know you didn't run with that supercharger during competition, but did you put that supercharger back on after the fact?
Yeah, so it's never been pulled off the car. It's always stayed on the car, but the way the Blitz supercharger works is the pulley has, it's got a clutch like an AC compressor.
Mm-hmm.
So the way that it's set up is it kicks on at a certain throttle percent. And that's how the Blitz controller works. So I just unplugged it and left the intake tube on the intake manifold instead of running through the supercharger and intercooler piping. And my plans are, I didn't want to run it this year because I competed and did well without it, that I didn't want to make a huge change to the car and really mess things up. But now the season's over, I'm finally going to get that put together and on. I've been having fuel pump issues, and I think I finally got them sorted out. That was another thing, is I didn't want to supercharge the car and then have fuel system issues, because then you could really do some serious engine damage. I wanted to make sure that my car was nice and reliable. My fuel system was nice and reliable before I added forced induction to it.
Yeah, watching your YouTube series, I know about the fuel issues, and I know you've got a fuel cell back there. So what was the reason behind putting a fuel cell in there as opposed to the stock fuel tank?
My car being an SR5 and one that sat in a field for 3 or 4 years before I got it, the tank was really rusty. And so I was always going through fuel pumps when I was 4AG powered, or not fuel pumps, but fuel filters. They just kept getting plugged up from all the rust. And so when I moved to Michigan, I was trying to locate a GTS tank, but my friend said, "Hey, I've got this fuel cell you can have for free." And I was like, "Oh, sweet." And I put it in, and ever since I put it in, I've absolutely regretted it. I put it in, I cut up the floor pan, I cut off the straps for the fuel tank, and, after I killed my first fuel pump, I knew instantly, I was like, man, I should have just gotten a GTS tank.
Oh.
But I keep thinking, I know so many people run with fuel cells without issues, and I've talked to probably 24 people about all my issues, trying to figure out why I keep killing fuel pumps. And, I see people who want to put a fuel cell in their car, because race car. I just go, you know what? Unless you're having issues, I say you should just stick with a stock tank. It's not worth the headaches. You got to change so much stuff. It's going to cost you, even though I got the fuel cell for free. I even got my AN lines for free for the fuel system. I think about pumps and filters and fittings and all these different things that it would have been so much cheaper just to get a GTS tank and put that in.
So what fuel pump issues were you having? And then how do you think you solved it?
So the first fuel pump issues I had was I was using a filter that was just too small. I liked it because it was, it had a good footprint for setting up the fuel system. It wasn't a huge fuel filter. It didn't take up a whole lot of space, and I thought that was great. But the actual filter element was like the size of a quarter. So that kept getting plugged up and causing restriction, killing the pump. And then I think, once I changed that, I think what started killing fuel pumps is heat. So going from Michigan, where it's quite a bit cooler, even during the summer, than it is here in South Carolina. Here in South Carolina, the heat, it just gets so darn hot. I mean, I think at round 2 and round 3, the track temperature was 130 degrees. That's what the pavement was. So, and my exhaust is routed about 4 inches from my fuel cell. So I think what was happening is the fuel was getting heat soaked, and that was heat soaking the pump. And just by the end of the day, it just was so hot and so overworked that, it finally put out or went out or was starting to reduce pressure. So, what I did to fix that was I put the pump in tank, and I actually used an inline pump inside of the fuel cell with a hydromat, thinking, well, I might as well put a hydromat on here because then I can make sure I'm not getting any fuel slosh issues. But even doing that, I realized I killed a pump in one event, and I was like, I don't understand. This shouldn't happen anymore. And I pulled it apart, and I realized that the size, I thought it was just the perfect size, and it's like 5 millimeters, maybe, too tall. So it's putting pressure on the pickup of the pump and just restricting it. So I decided, I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to go simple. I'm just going to grab a regular in-tank pump and just make sure that my fuel cell is above half a tank all the time and just see if that fixes it. So that's my last configuration here that I've got to test out. And I think that's what's done it this time. Is I think this will finally be reliable for me.
Awesome, man. Well, fingers crossed. And I'm sure we're all very familiar with Corolla nuances and headaches, kind of like that.
Yeah, man.
One other thing that I'm really curious about your car, that Volvo 240 rear axle. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. So that's actually a really funny story. I was a buddy of mine is a turbo bricker. That's what the Volvo guys are called. That's their community is turbo bricks, because Volvo's are referred to as bricks, and then there's the turbo models. So a buddy of mine has a couple of them, and I was looking at sourcing a rear axle for my car, and I was looking at a GTS rear axle or a Celica Super rear axle, the typical Corolla rear ends, but they were like $1,000 or more for something that was already worn out that was going to need a rebuild. And it just blew my mind. I'm like, this rear axle isn't that strong for that price. And so I started looking at truck rear axles. And my turbo brick buddy, he was like, well, why don't you just go get a Volvo 240 rear axle? And I didn't even realize that they were rear wheel drive at the time. So he helped me figure out there's two different Volvo rear ends. There's a Dana 30 and then there's a Volvo 1031. Those are the differentials. So the Dana 30 is the same that's used like in the front of a Jeep Cherokee. So there's tons of gearing options for them. But they're a weaker rear end compared to the Volvo 1031, which is pretty much the same thing as Dana 30, but the ring gear and pinion gear is half an inch larger. So it's really strong, and the axles are super beefy. So that's what I ended up sourcing, was a Volvo 1031 rear axle. You know, I got it from a junkyard for like $200, and I had them ship it to my house for $200. It was super cheap. And then I grabbed Excessive Manufacturing. You know, they make their upper and lower mounts for 4-links, and I got those because they've got adjustments for anti-squat, and, you know, they've pretty much got like built-in traction brackets. So I could get the pinion angle set a little bit better and get a little bit better suspension geometry. And, you know, even for a rear end, that, you know, I think the hardest thing about the Volvo rear end is gearing options are really limited in the States. So the shortest gearing you can get from a factory Volvo is going to be a 4.1. Which is okay with the J160, the 6-speed from the beams. It's pretty decent, but not quite ideal. I think I'd like to have a 4.3. It was either, and then you can get shorter gearing from Europe, but you're looking at, you know, $600-700 for a ring and pinion. And for me, having this junkyard rear end that I've only spent a couple, you know, all in, even with the rebuild, I think I've spent maybe $600 on this rear axle setup. And I'm like, you know, I'll just keep running it how it is. I have a hard time justifying spending the extra $600 on better gearing. I decided to, you know, I'm going to supercharge it instead and overcome the gearing problems with more power.
So this Volvo rear axle, what size ring and pinion is it?
I think it's about 7 3/4 inch, if I remember correctly. So it's, you know, a Celica Supra is 6.7 inch, and this is, you know, pretty much an inch larger than that.
So that Volvo rear axle, what are you using for brakes on that thing?
So I'm just using the factory Volvo rear calipers, and I have no mechanical handbrake. That's the one downside to it, because normally it uses, you know, it's got the drum in disc setup, right? Instead of having the handbrake being built into the rear caliper.
Oh, I see.
But the rear calipers are large 2-piston calipers, so that's pretty nice. The brakes are pretty big. But the one downside is I don't have an actual mechanical parking brake. So I put it in gear, and if I know I'm going to be going somewhere, or I'm going to be parked on a hill, I just bring a wheel chock with me and put it behind the wheel.
Oh man, yeah, that's tough. I mean, another common theme is like we don't really have a good rear axle option. I mean, that's worldwide right now.
Yeah, it's such a problem for Corollas. I think mainly because the width, right?
Mm-hmm.
I've wanted to put a quick change rear axle in my car for a long time. You know, that's a pretty hefty bill. You know, putting a quick change rear axle in a car is, you know, you're probably looking at a couple $1,000. I just
Hmm.
haven't been able to justify it yet. But the hardest thing is even trying to order one, they're hard to find. There's only like 2 or 3 different ones that are actually narrow enough for an AE86 because
Mm.
everything is wider. And so for other cars, other solid axle cars, you just go pick up something out of a Mustang or whatever else and it's going to fit. But those even are just a little bit too wide for Corollas.
Hmm. That's a good point that I didn't think about is actually the width of the rear axles. I'm sure you're well aware of the Ford 8.8, how popular it is stateside, but even that thing, part of modification to fit our chassis, you got to narrow it quite a bit.
Yeah, that was something before I did the Volvo rear end. Is I thought I was going to put a Ford 8.8 in my car, and I looked at it, and I had never shortened an axle tube before. I never built a rear end before, custom did any mounts on a rear axle before. So I was kind of going back and forth of like, okay, do I try and learn how to shorten an axle tube, or do I try and find something that's better? And that was probably the best thing about the Volvo rear axle is that it's a good width for a Corolla. I have custom 35 millimeter 2-piece wheel adapters because I still wanted to use my 4x114 wheels because Volvos have a weird bolt pattern, like 5x108. So
Mm.
I got these
Okay.
custom wheel adapters, and even with those, like it's only a little bit wider than say a Celica Super axle. So it's worked out really well for me, and I didn't have to shorten anything. I thought that was great. All I had to do was weld new mounts on, and that was it.
Awesome. Is there anything else with your beam swap that you is like particularly interesting or you have a personal touch to that you wanted to shine a light on?
Let me think. I think that one thing that's different about my swap versus most is my ECU choice. So, most people are running, Matt Panic and Mark Panic from Panic Made. They do wiring harnesses, and the main ECU that they install now is from Link, which is a great, fantastic product. But the ECU I chose for my build is an Adaptronic. I actually went to PRI a few years back when I was living in Michigan because I was trying to find an ECU company to work with for beam swaps. And I talked to AEM, I talked to Haltech, I talked to Adaptronic, and I talked to all these different companies. And I was pretty surprised that when I went to go talk to AEM, I found out they actually don't own the software for their Infinity ECUs, which is like their newer ECUs that they've been making.
Mm-hmm.
They build the computer, but they don't actually own the software. So there wasn't the right cam and crank signal triggers set up in the software, and they couldn't add it. And when I went and talked to Adaptronic, this is a small company, tiny booth at PRI, and they had a bunch of rotaries. But I saw they're an ECU company, and so I asked him and says, "Hey, I've got an AE86, I've got a 4-cylinder, high compression, dual variable valve timing, and I'm looking for an ECU that can control these things. What can you tell me about your products?" And Andy, who was the owner, he's since sold the company to Haltech, and he's one of the engineers for Haltech now. He looks at me and goes, "Are you running a beams?" I'm like, "Yeah, man, I am." And he's like, "Oh, cool. All right, so let me show you my lineup of ECUs, and here's the pros and cons of mine." And then he also compared every other ECU company that was there, and it was probably the most incredible thing. And I've gotten such awesome support from Adaptronic, over the couple of years I've been running their ECU. And the main reason why I chose it is because it's got one, the customer support was great, but they also have probably the best fuel strategy model out of any ECU for, under $2,000. They use a fuel pressure sensor, so it'll actually adjust your fuel injector pulse based on fuel pressure. So if your pump is going out, the ECU can actually account for that and adjust so that way you don't lean out if your pump is starting to go bad or if you're plugging up a fuel filter.
Yeah, that's interesting. Adaptronic, you don't hear that name brought up as often. So you said they actually sold to Haltech?
Yeah, so I've kind of tried to follow up on it a little bit because I was a little worried. I was like, "Oh no, I'm going to lose support for my ECU in my car."
Mm-hmm.
Andy did sell the company. He did sell Adaptronic to Haltech, and I think like Haltech came out with a new PDM, and I think that a lot of that was Andy's brain behind that. But as I've talked to Andy a little bit and talked to the other guys at Adaptronic, Haltech has no plans to kill off the Adaptronic brand because they have. One, they've got some really unique things like their fuel model, but also they've got a really good hold in like the rotary community. And
Okay.
their ECUs are phenomenal. They really are. Like I'm super happy with it, and the software is really easy to use. And I think, because they have such a firm hold in other parts of the world where maybe Haltech doesn't have the same kind of market penetration, and especially with rotaries, I mean, they are fantastic ECUs. They're capable of so much, but they've always been a small company because it was, Andy was the owner and the lead engineer for the company. So, he was kind of doing everything. And then he had a couple other engineers he worked with. And so it was, I think that the hardest thing was for a while, production was slow because they're a small company. And now there's no problems with supply for ECUs. They're readily available because they're kind of under that Haltech umbrella now.
Let's talk about your YouTube channel. What was your decision to start the YouTube channel?
I realized, I loved putting together my drift videos from after a drift event. And I started my website a little over a year ago, about a year and a half ago, because I realized that the information from forums was dying. And the information has just started disappearing. So I started cataloging information and trying to grab even just the beams information that was available on certain websites was disappearing too. Mm-hmm. So I started my website with trying to capture that information and keep it stored somewhere. So that way, in case somebody had any questions or whatever, it's still on the internet somewhere. And then I started, copying and pasting links from my website into the Beams group and other, A86 groups, and people are asking Beams questions because it says, hey, here's all the frequently asked questions. Here's everything. Here's a guide to swap, and it should answer all your questions. And if not, shoot me a message. But then I realized that as I started enjoying editing these videos more, I had people asking me, well, hey, why don't you just put a video up about this? People would rather watch a video than read an article, which was strange to me because I really I like technical. I love forums and I love reading all the technical forums and different types of media. But I think the generations have kind of changed and people enjoy watching videos more. So that's why I started putting out. I said, okay, well, I'll start a YouTube channel. I'll start putting my drift videos there. That's what it kind of started as a place to put my drift videos. And then as people asked me to do videos on beam swap stuff, I started putting it out there, and I realized man, I've got a lot of knowledge of this now, and this is a great way for me to capture that. It'd be really cool to start making money off of YouTube, right? But I'm a long ways off from that. Right now, I'm still just enjoying putting content out there and interacting with people.
Yeah, and I really get that sense from your YouTube videos. And yeah, I know I'm definitely fighting that struggle too, where it's like, as much as I would really like to make that YouTube money, I much prefer creating content that can provide value for a lot of people, just like you're doing.
Yeah, it's so funny. Like, I put together, when I started focusing on, okay, if I want to build my views and try and get a wider audience, what kind of content do I want to put out? And I looked at a lot of there's a couple of, large auto YouTube channels where it's a lot of, trendy, hip kind of stuff. And they try and talk about technical information. And me, my job is I'm a technical expert for an OEM. That's what my job is. So I've got a lot of knowledge on all these technical nitty gritty things. And I sit there and cringe and go, oh no, that's not right. That's not right. And so I started focusing on, okay, I'm going to put out quality content because I have a lot of experience and knowledge now that I've built over the years. And I want to put out as much technically accurate stuff. And what I found is, as I started putting together these videos, I was getting a lot of views. And I have probably my video with the most views and the most watch time is a short 5-minute video of me talking about putting ITBs on a beams and the stuff that you got to get with it bolted on. And it was such a short video, but it was something that people ask all the time in the beams group. Hey, what do I need to do for ITBs? And, I put out kind of what I would consider almost like a timeless technical topic. And instead of trying to build views off of trendy hype stuff, it's long-lasting content and material that's not going to be outdated easily. And that's what I try and focus on with most of my content because, I want the information to last a long time. I want it to be useful for a long time. And if it needs to be updated, well, then I could put a new video out with updates. But that's kind of what I try and focus on because I think if I'm ever gonna make that YouTube money, it made more sense to me to try and put out content that was going to be long lasting and stuff that I have pretty intimate knowledge of. And that seems to, that those videos do way better than any of my drift videos. People, I get a ton of views on all my technical stuff, and I get like maybe 100 views on most of my drift videos.
That's interesting because you would think it'd be opposite, right? You'd think all the drift stuff would get all the views.
Yeah, and that's what I thought too. But then, as I realized, there's thousands of people on YouTube posting drift videos.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that really differentiates me from other people is I'm still actively drifting an AE86. There aren't very many of us left.
Mm-hmm.
I'm usually the only AE86 at a drift event, and I think in the last 3 years, I've seen 2 or 3 other 86s at drift events. Total 2 or 3 other ones besides mine. We're just, A86 drifters are such a small crowd now. So that's the only kind of attention that that they're the only thing that kind of gives me a leg up over other drifters. But man, I'm not super great at editing drift videos. I'm not super great at, filming and doing color correction and all that stuff. And I don't know how to do those, all them hype videos and whatever that, all these dang kids are posting. But, I try and put quality content together, but, drifting just is, I think it's just the market for that is overwhelmed. Whereas, somebody who's technically accurate and is able to share, technical information in a way that's understandable, that's something that there aren't as many, there isn't as many of those kind of channels out there.
Yeah, completely agree. With that being said, what can we expect? What future content can we expect on the Doctored Garage YouTube channel?
So I've got a list of a couple of other beam swap stuff and 8.6, technical topics that once I've got some time, I'd like to do some videos on. I've been asked a couple of times about rear end setup, especially for, one-piece drive shafts. I put together a video talking about the differences, but I've had a couple of people ask me, well, okay, what angles do I need to shoot for and stuff like that. So, I have a few things like that, but things that you'll probably see over the next, probably the next 6 to 8 months is going to be me building this hatchback 8.6 that I brought home because it's a bare shell and I'm swapping everything over to it so I can have a nice beams streetcar with AC and everything. So I think that's what a lot of my, non-technical, videos will be. And I'm hoping too that as MB Drift gets a new venue or a few new venues, I'll post some videos about that. And then, something I started up this last year was online drift school. So, I've got enough experience now, and I constantly, I play Assetto Corsa with a bunch of people, people that are, who have won drift competitions and whatever at a grassroots level, and a couple of them, have, compete in Pro-Am or Pro 2. So I've gotten a lot of information from these guys, and so I try and share that with people at the local track. And something I started doing was, send me some videos, and I'll take a look at what you're doing and give you some pointers. And so that's something I've started, is this online drift school to be able to give people pointers, and, if they're struggling with something. And, I'd like to do some other vehicle setup stuff, talk about alignments, and go a little bit more in depth with the explanation. So, instead of people saying, hey, what specs do I put on my car? Well, let me help you understand what specs you should shoot for. Or if you're trying to change your car, if you feel like your car is it's understeering, well, this is how to get it to stop understeering, things like that.
Awesome, man. Well, we're just about 13 minutes to our 1 hour mark. And I know I've asked you like a mouthful of questions. So I wanted to give you the opportunity. If you had any questions for me, or is there like any other topics you wanted to bring up?
Ooh, man, you're asking if I have questions. That's something I wasn't prepared for.
Man.
What's, I've only been in California a few times, and I've never stopped to see the 8.6 scene. But, I guess here's a question, since you live out west, is, I'm used to being the only A86 at a car meet or at a drift event or whatever. What's it like out west? It seems like there's a bunch of people, a high concentration of 8.6s, but I have no idea, honestly.
Yeah, we're spoiled out here. That's the short answer. Sorry, but it's majority concentrated in, I would say, the Bay Area where I'm at, and then also Southern California, so like LA area. There's a really high concentration. So we are 100% spoiled and numb to, a lot of things where, I've had guests on the podcast where like, yeah, I'm the one Corolla owner in my country, or, one of 5 in my country. So yeah, we have here in the Bay Area a Corolla meet every first Friday of the month. It's, how do you say it? Yeah, definitely spoiled in California. I would say I take it for granted. Like talking to a lot of guests, even in other states, I take it for granted, like how spoiled we are out here, especially in the Bay Area.
Man, that's wild. I can't even imagine. I'm used to being, like even when I was living in Utah, me and my roommates, we had like 386s, and we were like one of like three people in the city that had 860. We had like high concentration at our house or whatever. So that's pretty crazy to me to hear that. I mean, an 86 meat would be fantastic. I mean, it's hard enough for me just to find other Japanese classic cars out here.
So that's an interesting question. What is the enthusiast car scene like out there in South Carolina?
Well, the enthusiast car scene in South Carolina used to be great. I don't know if you ever saw any of the videos or know about like the Nopi car meets from like way back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
Because those are really cool. Awesome tuners and mini trucks and all kinds of cool stuff. But pretty much the car scene here now is squat trucks. That's like the big thing where they lift the front and they'll either keep the rear at the stock height or they'll lower it. And it's not for me, man. And that's pretty much the car scene here. There's there are a couple of car meets, but surprisingly, being in Myrtle Beach in a tourist destination, the car scene is actually pretty small. It's a tight knit group, but it's smaller than I would have expected. Aside from the squat trucks, there are a lot of classic cars out here. So in the summer, there's usually they call it the Run to the Sun car meet here in Myrtle Beach, and that's probably one of the largest classic American car meets or get-togethers on the East Coast. So that's really cool. That's one thing I'm not used to, is having such a high concentration of American classic cars. And like even when I'm driving around for work, when I'm driving through the country, like I remember like the first week on the job, I stopped at this little motel that was closed down, but a guy was using to park all of his classic cars, and he had like a dozen classic American cars sitting there, and it was just so cool to see stuff like that.
Squat truck has to be a regional thing. I swear I've never heard of a squat truck before.
It is. It's totally a regional thing. It's as I've kind of traveled around a little bit, you get pre-runner, in Arizona you've got pre-runner trucks where it's kind of a little bit squatted. The front is a little bit higher than the back, but it's functional, right? Because on pre-runner trucks or trophy trucks, the front suspension travel is meant for up travel, and the rear suspension travel is meant for down travel. So you get just a little bit of a rake to it. And then I've heard about the Cali lean, which is sort of based on pre-runner style, but for, cruising around the streets. And, I've heard about it. I haven't really seen it. But man, squat trucks is a whole new extreme. If you just look up, Carolina squat trucks or something on Google, you'll probably sit there and shake your head. It's obnoxious. It really is.
Oh my
Headlights
God.
are pointed at the sky, man. They took over the Nopi car show. It's no longer a car show. It's the Nopi, the Nopi National Squat Show is pretty much what it is. And I think
Oh my God.
I think it just got named like the Myrtle Beach Nationals because Nopi is, Nopi hasn't been around for years. And then, but they kept the car show going, and now it's just the Myrtle Beach Nationals, and it happens, I think, once or twice a summer now.
Oh man.
I guess you asked me about future content. What kind of future content, can people expect from you?
I took a big sigh because I felt like that's like an existential crisis for me right now. I mean, similar to what you said, I see this void for people who want technical content or, people who want to learn, a place where, like an FAQ, basically like an FAQ for our chassis. But the issue, kind of like you said, it's like not as popular as that content we see that, is popular, but unfortunately is popular for a very short amount of time. Yeah. So that's what I'm trying to figure out right now is like, do I strike this balance between, like a popular topic that's also technical? Is striking a balance not the right thing to do? Should I go one way or the other? I think that's really where I'm struggling right now.
Yeah, man, it's hard. It's trying to figure out what you want to spend your time on and what's going to be worthwhile and not only for your followers and subscribers and viewers, but what's going to be most worthwhile for your time. And that's what I mean. That's what I struggle with, is trying to figure out what's worth me devoting my time to.
Yeah. And then A little bit of like a personal aside. So last week I had a pretty long phone conversation with like a older member of the community, or not an older member, like a member of the Corolla community in SoCal who's been in the community for a long time. And he was telling me about he's heard I've wanted to monetize the media work, but he's basically, given me these options where like I would have to put my stuff behind a paywall, or I really would have to make a jump between, being acting like a media company full time, or am I going to, focus on the repair side of the Autohaus the full time. He was telling me like I can't straddle both. I would need to go all in on one or the other. So again, like different voices I hear, which I respect all of them, but yeah, I mean, just to put it in short, definitely having like an existential crisis right now.
I mean, I try to make a go at selling parts, and with, the for me, the problem with, trying to sell parts is like, one, I wanted to be honest to my viewers and to my, to my followers of, I'm unbiased when I review parts or when I talk about things. I wanted to stay as unbiased as possible. But once I find a product that I think is worth investing in and that's is worthwhile, I'm like, well, that'd be great. Once I find it, and then I can, I can start selling that product. But, I ran into issues with, Doctored Garage is it's a hobby. It's not really a job for me. It's something I do for fun more than anything. It'd be great to make money off of it a little bit because I enjoy it, but my focus hasn't been to make money. And I thought, well, maybe if I start selling parts through Doctored Garage, that I'll start, it'll help me support my drift habits a little bit. And so, I started selling, like one of the things for a beam swap is the mass airflow sensor housing. Because the beams has a really particular intake setup. The calibration is crazy. Like in the factory housing, there's like a 90-degree bend right after the mass airflow sensor. So the calibration is really weird for the mass airflow sensor. But if you get a mass airflow sensor with a airflow straightener, well, then there's no problems. So I started selling those because I got in really well with the company that makes them, and I can offer people pretty much the best price out there. And so I sold a couple of them, and it was great for a little bit. But then I realized, like, selling parts, it wasn't quite as worthwhile or as lucrative as I thought it was going to be, because I'm not doing it full time, and I don't have, setting up accounts with companies is actually really hard. For somebody that's not doing it full time, because the discounts just aren't there to be able to make a decent profit off of it.
Yeah, totally understandable. And people who are familiar with resale in the automotive aftermarket know too that the margins are extremely slim and only getting slimmer.
Yeah, because I know that I always, I've got friends that, like one of my good friends here in South Carolina, they're the owners of J&A Performance, which is a Subaru performance part, retailer. And because I've been on the other side of it, where I know how slim the margins are, like I know that they'll hook me up and give me a good price, but I never ask for it because I know the margins really aren't that great, and you have to sell such a high volume to make a decent living. And trying to do it on the side just for fun, just to help support drifting was it just wasn't super worthwhile. And I still sell the mass airflow sensor housings, not necessarily to make a profit, but just to help people out and get them a little bit of a discount off of retail. Or off of full retail, right? That's what it came down to. Is okay, I'm selling parts because I can help people, and it's just a little bit different take on it, and that seems to make me feel better about it, because I'm not trying to make a huge profit off it. I'm just trying to make it worthwhile in my time. So I haven't set up, I don't have a web store or anything, just because, well, that's more cost, to me, for something that I'm not really striving to drive a whole lot of sales from or whatever. So it's hard. And, I've also been on the other side of it, where I was turning wrenches for a living as a technician, and I know how hard that is. And so I'm like, man, like, content is fun. Creating content is fun, but trying to do auto repair as a living is difficult. And trying to do, when I see people that they've got a YouTube channel or some type of content that they're doing, that they're trying to monetize, like a Patreon or whatever, and then they're also working on cars for their day job, and they're doing all that stuff. I'm like, man, I don't know how people do it, because that's just so much time and so much energy.
Completely agree. So, Devin, I want to thank you so much again for doing this podcast with me, man. You have such a great foundation of a YouTube channel right now, and you have I mean, I really respect the media work you've done so far. And yeah, man, I just want to say, keep at it. Yeah, I mean, I really applaud the work you've put in so far.
Thanks. I appreciate that. It's I have a couple of people that that say things like that, and I'm like, when I was out in Arizona, I actually stopped and met Mark Panic in Tucson, because that's where I picked up a car dolly from, and he lives there, and he's like, hey, well, you should stop by when you're in town. And it was so funny because he's like, oh, you're the guy from the Beams Facebook group, and I'm sitting here like, oh my gosh, you're the guy from Panic Made. And we both were kind of like fanboying each other. It was really funny, and it's for people to compliment me on hey, thanks for all the information or put that stuff out there. I'm like, oh, I don't think of it as a big deal, and so it makes me feel really good when people compliment me on stuff like that, because it's, to me, it's just I'm not trying to do it for anything other than just to help people answer questions. And when people say how much it's helped them, I'm like, oh well, I'm glad. That's really, it's hard to make money off of YouTube, but if I help people, then that's really, really what I go for. If I'm helping people, that's what matters the most.
Awesome. Well said, man. Well, where can we find you? Where can we find Doctored Garage? Do you have any other things to shout out?
Yeah, so doctoredgarage.com. That's my website. It's a little difficult to navigate sometimes. I'm still kind of getting a little better layout for it, but I've got all my technical write-ups in there for beam swap information. But I've also covered the same information on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/doctoredgarage. I'm on Facebook, at Doctored Garage, as well as on Instagram at Doctored Garage. Most of what I do is on YouTube and on Facebook. I'm not really great at Instagramming. I'm trying to still figure that out. But yeah, that's where you can see all of my stuff. And if you got questions about any beams things, or if you have any suggestions for beams topics that aren't covered in other videos or elsewhere, shoot me a message on Facebook, or leave me a comment, or on one of my YouTube videos, and I'll see what I can do to help you out.
Awesome, man. Devin Crezee from Doctored Garage. Thank you so much again, man. And yeah, we'll definitely have you on again. If you have something new to announce or just want to shoot the shit about Corollas again, man, let me know.
Sounds good, man. Thank you. I appreciate it.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And please leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, as reviews really help support us. You can do it straight from your desktop. Don't even need an Apple device. This is Autohaus Z. Thanks for all the support, you guys.